Hey guys, tonight we're spending some time in the Pacific Northwest, in the quiet towns and green river valleys of Washington and Oregon, in the places where the rain comes down soft and the forest starts just past the last streetlight. We're going to sit with the stories of several people who walked out into an ordinary evening in this part of the world and never came home. A 10-year-old girl on a 4-block walk in a town where everyone knew everyone. A toddler in the arcade of a bowling alley on a Saturday night. A young woman chasing a book and a horizon across the whole width of the country. A teenager who missed the last bus home from the fair. A little girl one day short of her 5th birthday. A 7-year-old boy who stood proudly beside a science project he had built with his own hands. A 2-year-old boy left sleeping in a car on the shoulder of a busy road. An 8-year-old girl carried out of her own bed in the middle of a thunderstorm. And a 4-year-old boy who vanished from a crowded playground in the middle of the day, in front of 50 people. Different years, different towns, one region, and the same unbearable silence at the center of each of them. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. No pressure and no guilt. And thank you, truly, for all the case suggestions that keep this channel going. We are also now on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you would rather rest your eyes and just listen there instead. Now dim the lights, get comfortable. This is a long one, and every single person in it deserves to be heard carefully, not as a headline and not as a mystery to be solved, but as someone who is loved and who is still missed tonight by people who have never stopped waiting for them. Have you ever wondered how a person can vanish from a place that is full of other people? How a town of barely 1,000 souls can search every field and every shed and still come up empty? How the ordinary can turn, in the space of a single evening, into something that no one can explain, no matter how many years pass? To understand these stories, we need to go to them one at a time, slowly, and in order. So let's begin in a small logging town in Grays Harbor County on a warm night in the summer of 2009. Let's talk about Lindsay Baum. McCleary is the kind of place people move to when they want their children to be safe. It sits in the timber country of western Washington, off the highway that runs toward the coast. A town of somewhere around 1,400 people, where the mill and the forest and the 2-lane streets all seem to fold into one another. Everybody knew what everybody was doing. That was the whole point of it. When Melissa Baum was newly divorced and looking for a fresh start, she left Tennessee and brought her 2 children across the country to this little town on the edge of the trees, because she believed, the way any mother would want to believe, that a place this small and this quiet would be safer than the cities she was leaving behind. Her daughter Lindsay was 10 years old. She was a brown-haired, brown-eyed girl who loved the Harry Potter books and the Twilight novels, the kind of reader who disappeared into stories and came out wanting to make her own. She told people she wanted to be a writer and an illustrator someday, and she wanted to be a veterinarian because more than almost anything, she loved animals. She was 2 weeks shy of her 11th birthday. Her mother had a whole life planned around watching her grow into all of those dreams. You're in McCleary on the night of June 26th, 2009. It is a warm summer evening, still light out the way it stays light late in the Northwest in June. The sky going soft and gold over the rooftops, Lindsay has spent the day the way children spend summer days in a small town, swimming with her friends, drifting in and out of the house, coming home to shower and change. In the early evening, she leaves to walk over to her friend Michaela's house, just a few blocks away, to see about spending the night and to grab some clothes. Her older brother goes with her at first. There is a small argument between them, something ordinary about a bike, and he rides off ahead, leaving Lindsay to walk the last short stretch home by herself. It is a walk of maybe 10 minutes, 4 blocks, in a town where everyone knew everyone. A neighbor saw her a little after 9 o'clock that evening, walking along Maple Street, somewhere between 5th and 6th. That is the last confirmed sighting of Lindsay Baum. Somewhere in those few remaining blocks, on a summer street in a town of 1,400 people, a 10-year-old girl vanished and no one saw it happen. When Lindsay did not come home that night, her mother called the police. And here is where the smallness of the town, the very thing that was supposed to keep her safe, became part of the tragedy. In a place like McCleary, everyone turns out. Hundreds of officers and volunteers and cadaver dogs came through, combing a town of fewer than 2,000 people, walking the fields and the forest edge, knocking on doors, searching sheds and cars and the spaces between houses. Thousands of dollars in reward money went up, countless tips came in, and none of it led anywhere. It was as though the ground had simply opened and closed again over the space where she had been. Now, to be fair to the people who searched, they did not stop. This was not a case that faded quietly into a filing cabinet. Investigators chased leads for years. At one point, a store surveillance recording put a local man under a bright light of suspicion as a person of interest before he was effectively set to the side. Over the years, other names surfaced and were examined, and one by one did not hold. There were arrests in the region of men accused of terrible things against children, men whose homes were searched for any thread that might tie them to Lindsay, and each time the thread did not connect. Years later, a man already imprisoned for a separate crime committed in that same small town against another young girl was looked at closely for any link to Lindsay's case and reportedly passed a polygraph when questioned about her. It is important to be careful here. No one has ever been charged in Lindsay Baum's case. Every person who was looked at and released is, in the eyes of the law and in simple fairness, not responsible for what happened to her unless and until that is proven. What all of it adds up to is a case with many shadows and no face. For nearly 9 years, Lindsay was simply gone. Her mother describes that span as a separate lifetime, the years between the disappearing and the knowing. She held her breath, she has said, and she held on to hope because she truly believed her daughter would come home. And then, in September of 2017, hunters walking through a remote stretch of forest on the far, dry side of the mountains found human remains. The place was in Kittitas County, off a road near Ellensburg, more than 120 miles from McCleary, on the opposite side of the Cascade Range from the coastal timber town where Lindsay was last seen. It took months of testing at the federal laboratory in Virginia. In May of 2018, the sheriff of Grays Harbor County stood in front of cameras and said the words that ended one unbearable wait and began another. They had brought Lindsay home. The remains were hers. Have you ever thought about what that distance means? More than 100 miles, over a mountain pass, from a 4-block walk in a small town to a remote forest on the arid eastern plateau. Whoever took Lindsay Baum did not simply act on an impulse and hide her nearby. She was carried across the state. That single fact reframed everything the investigators thought they knew, and it turned a missing child case, at last and officially, into a kidnapping and a homicide. It also, cruelly, did not tell them who. There are theories, and it is worth being honest that they remain theories. Some believe the answer is local, that in a town where everyone knew everyone, someone Lindsay trusted, or at least did not fear, offered her a ride or drew her aside in those last few blocks, and that the same someone knew the back roads well enough to carry her over the mountains. Others have wondered whether the answer passed through McCleary from somewhere else entirely, a stranger moving along the highways of the Northwest, and that the town's very openness, its habit of not locking doors and not fearing the dark, is exactly what made a child on a summer street so terribly reachable. Investigators who have worked the case for years have said, plainly, that they believe it is solvable, that someone out there knows something, and that the whole case may turn on that one person finally deciding to speak. Today, Lindsay's case is still open, and it is still, by the account of the people closest to it, active. There is a reward, tens of thousands of dollars, for information that leads to an arrest. Her mother has spent these years living in what she calls 3 lifetimes, the before, the missing, and the since. She marks the birthdays Lindsay never reached. She thinks about the grandchildren she might have had. She wears her daughter's ashes in a pendant close to her chest, and she has asked, more than once, in the plainest possible words, for whoever did this to simply come forward and tell the truth. In the years since Lindsay was found, the people who love her have refused to let the case slide back into silence. A private investigator has worked it for the better part of a decade and has said in recent years that the case is more active now than it has ever been, that it is genuinely solvable, and that it will most likely turn on a single person who knows something and finally decides to say so. The investigators who have handled it followed threads into some very dark corners along the way. At one point, the search widened to ask whether a set of elderly brothers arrested elsewhere in the region and found with deeply disturbing material might simply have had the opportunity to be near McCleary on the night Lindsay vanished. That thread, like every other, was run all the way down, and it did not connect. Lindsay's mother has since poured her grief into a foundation created in her daughter's name, meant to fund and push forward investigations into other unsolved cases, so that other families might not have to wait the way she has waited. And the town itself has wrestled with how to hold the memory. At one point, some of the signs bearing Lindsay's face were quietly taken down, and then, after the family pushed back, more of them went up. Because that is the grinding, unglamorous work that falls to the people left behind. Not only the grief, but the daily labor of making sure the rest of the world does not get to forget. Which is to say, more than 15 years later, a mother is still standing in the space of those 4 blocks, still asking the same question the whole town asked on that warm June night. Where is Lindsay? And the town and the forest and the mountains in between them have still not answered. Now picture a different night, a few years earlier, and a place that could not seem more ordinary. Not a quiet street at dusk this time, but a room full of light and noise and families on a cold Saturday evening in the middle of a Tacoma winter. Because sometimes a person does not vanish from an empty place at all. Sometimes they vanish from the middle of a crowd. Let's talk about Tika Lewis. Tika was 2 years old. She was a small girl with a big presence, described by her older sisters as a mature toddler who nonetheless almost never left her mother's side. She was of African American, white, and Native American heritage, with family ancestry in the Turtle Mountain Band of the Chippewa. There is home video of her from Christmas Day of 1998, just weeks before, the kind of footage every family takes and never imagines they will one day be playing on a loop for detectives and news cameras. In it, she is just a happy little girl at the holidays. She had 2 years of memories, her mother would later say. 2 years. That is all anyone was given. On the night of January 23rd, 1999, her mother, Teresa, took the family out bowling. They went to a place called the New Frontier Lanes on Center Street in Tacoma, a busy neighborhood alley that on a Saturday night was packed with couples on dates and kids with their friends and families crowded into the lanes. Teresa had come with a large group, family and friends, and she had brought her 2 youngest with her, Tika and the baby, Tika's little sister, who was only 10 months old and asleep in her car seat. Teresa brought the youngest 2 along, she later explained, precisely because she knew they would be a handful for anyone else to watch. So they were with her, where she could keep her eye on them. You're in the New Frontier Lanes on that Saturday night. The air smells like popcorn and cigarette smoke and the wax on the lanes. Pins are crashing, a jukebox is going, children are shrieking with laughter in the arcade at the end of the room, feeding quarters into the racing games. The arcade sits just a few feet from the lanes, close enough that a mother bowling a frame can glance over and see her children's heads bent over the machines, and it sits directly beside an emergency exit door that opens straight out onto the parking lot. It was Teresa's turn to bowl. Before she stepped up, she turned and saw Tika with the other children at the arcade games, small enough that she was reaching up toward the pedals of the race car game. Teresa threw her ball. She turned back around, and in the space of that single frame, that 10 or 15 seconds, Tika was gone. At first, there was no reason to panic. The arcade was full of people. Surely her daughter was just behind a machine, just around a corner, just with a cousin. Teresa asked the others where Tika was, and someone said she was still playing games. But she was not. Teresa checked the bathroom. She checked the other bathroom at the far end of the alley, where a relative was standing with a baby of her own, and asked if Tika had come with her, and the answer was no. And that is the moment every parent listening will understand it, when the ordinary noise of a bowling alley turns into something roaring and silent at the same time. Her heart stopped, Teresa has said. She ran to the security officer and told him her daughter was missing, that she had searched everywhere, that Tika was simply nowhere. An announcement went out over the intercom. Backup was called. And the search that began that night grew, within days, into something enormous. Roughly 120 tips came in within the first 48 hours alone. Eventually, something like a dozen federal agents and dozens of Tacoma police officers were assigned to the case. The family did everything a family can do to help. Teresa took a polygraph and then took a second one to follow up on lingering questions, and she passed. She has never been considered a suspect. Tika's father was incarcerated at the time, and so was never a suspect either. Other family members took polygraphs as well, simply to clear themselves and be as useful as they could. Everyone did everything right, and still their little girl was gone. Over the years, the case gathered a set of details that have haunted investigators ever since, because each one is so specific, and none of them has ever quite connected to the others. There was a car. Witnesses described a maroon or dark-colored Pontiac Grand Am, a late 1980s or early 1990s model, with tinted windows and a spoiler, seen speeding out of the bowling alley parking lot at a high rate of speed at right about the time Tika went missing. And here is the detail that makes that car so hard to forget. Earlier that very same day, a similar vehicle had reportedly been involved in an attempt to lure two children away from a park only about a mile from the bowling alley. There was a man. In the years after, detectives released a description of someone seen inside the alley that night, a person they believed might be connected to what happened. He was described as a white man, roughly 30 to 40 years old at the time, around 5 feet 11, with a heavy build, wavy brown hair, a mustache, and, most distinctly, a face marked with pockmarks. He was wearing a blue checkered flannel shirt and jeans. There was a report of a man matching that description, seen walking with a little girl who looked like Tika, guiding her toward a bathroom. Years later, detectives were finally able to sit down and speak with a man who matched that description. In their own careful words, he said nothing during that conversation that convinced them he was involved, but he also said nothing that ruled him out completely. That person of interest has since died, which means that if he did know something, whatever he knew may have gone with him. It is important to say clearly that he was never charged and was never publicly named as the person responsible. And there was, on that same night, a strange and troubling encounter inside the alley itself. Witnesses recalled a woman who had been going around asking to hold other patrons' babies. After Tika disappeared, that same woman was reported to have taken Tika's infant sister out to her own car and refused, at first, to give the baby back to Teresa. Police intervened and detained her. She too was investigated. She too was never charged in connection with Tika. To this day, it is not known whether any of these threads, the car, the man, the woman, belong to the same story, or whether they are simply the ordinary strangeness that a crowded room on a Saturday night will always contain, made sinister only in hindsight by the terrible thing that happened in the middle of it. There is one more possibility that hangs over Tika's case, and it is the one her family clings to. Because Tika was so young, because no one ever saw her leave, and no trace of her was ever found, one of the detectives who worked the case has acknowledged that it is genuinely possible she is still alive somewhere, taken and raised by someone, and that she may not even know she was ever a kidnapped child. That is why, over the years, forensic artists have built age progression images of Tika, showing what she might look like as a grown woman in her 20s. Her mother wept the first time she saw one of those pictures, because after all the years, it finally looked like her daughter. Maybe, her mother has said, one day Tika will see that face and think, that girl looks like me. The investigation in those first days was enormous. Within roughly 48 hours, more than 100 tips had come in, and a task force of federal agents and Tacoma officers formed around the case. Over the years, that energy never entirely faded. A reenactment of the abduction was filmed to try to jog the public's memory. Detectives once went out and dug at a park on the Tacoma waterfront after a tipster came forward describing what he said were visions of the little girl, a measure of just how thin the leads sometimes were and how far investigators were willing to reach on the smallest chance of bringing her home. Forensic artists at a university laboratory built new age progression images every few years, each one carrying Tika forward into the young woman she might be, so that the public would always have a current face to recognize and not only the toddler from that winter night. The detective who took the case over years later put the central problem very simply. There was almost no physical evidence, and there was no clear eyewitness to the abduction itself, only the fragments, the car, the man, the woman that have never quite joined into a single picture. And so the search continues, kept alive by a family that has never once entertained the idea of stopping. Have you ever wondered what it is like to search for someone for that long, without a body to grieve or a grave to visit? Every year, on the anniversary of the night she disappeared, Tika's family and friends and neighbors gather at the spot where the bowling alley used to stand. The New Frontier Lanes is gone now. A home improvement store sits on the property, and its parking lot covers the ground where the arcade once was. They release balloons there with messages written on them into the grey Tacoma sky. Her older sister has stood at those gatherings and spoken directly to Tika across all the years and all the unknowing, telling her that her big sister still loves her and misses her and believes she will see her again someday. More than 2.5 decades later, the case remains unsolved. There is no named suspect and no primary suspect. The main obstacle, one detective has said with painful honesty, is simply a lack of evidence and the absence of any clear eyewitness to the abduction itself. A crowded room, 100 people, an emergency door standing open to the night, and not one person who can say for certain what they saw. Teresa still says the same thing she has said from the beginning. The one thing she will never do is give up on Tika. She just wants to know where her daughter is. The next story takes us north again, up toward the Canadian border, into the deep forest of the North Cascades, where the mountains fold up steep and green, and the logging roads trail off into nothing. And it is a different kind of case than the two we have just sat with, because this time the person at the center of it may have chosen, at least at first, to disappear. What we do not know is what happened after that choice. What we do not know is whether she ever got to change her mind. Let's talk about Leah Roberts. Leah was 23 years old, a young woman from Durham, North Carolina, the whole width of the country away from where her story would end. She was the youngest of 3 children. She had lost both of her parents while she was still very young. Her mother suddenly to heart failure, and her father to a long illness of the lungs. And by the time she was in her early 20s, she was carrying a grief that most people do not carry until they are much older. She had been a soccer player. She was fluent in Spanish, with a soft southern accent that people remembered. She had survived a serious car accident a few years earlier that had left her badly injured, a punctured lung and a shattered thigh bone, and she had healed from it. By the winter of 2000, Leah had dropped out of North Carolina State University, where she had been only a few months short of a degree in Spanish and anthropology. She was spending most of her time at a coffee house in town, writing poetry, filling journals, learning the guitar, teaching herself photography, and caring for a small kitten she had adopted, and she had fallen deeply into the writing of Jack Kerouac, the Beat Generation author of restless, searching road novels. She was especially taken with one of his books, an autobiographical story of road trips and mountain solitude that has scenes set on a peak in the very county in Washington where, though she could not have known it, her Jeep would one day be found. On the morning of March 9th, 2000, Leah left. She did not tell her family or her friends where she was going. Her roommate simply noticed that same day that her car was gone. But Leah did leave something behind. Her sister, Cara, found a note in her bedroom, marked with the drawing of a Cheshire cat smile, the grinning cat from Alice in Wonderland. On it, Leah had written that she was not suicidal, that she was in fact the opposite, and she told her sister to remember Jack Kerouac. To the people who loved her, that note, and Leah's deep love of Kerouac's road stories, said something clear. She had gone searching. She had set out on a cross-country trip to try to find some peace or some direction in the wake of everything she had lost. She had even left money behind for her roommate to cover the bills while she was away, which is not what a person does when they mean never to return. You're on the highway with her, somewhere in the middle of that long drive west. It is early 2000, before the world was mapped by phones. You have a full tank of gas and a kitten in the passenger seat, and a head full of a dead poet's words about the open road. Later, when her family looked at her bank records, they were able to trace her path across the country by the cash she withdrew along the way. Larger sums than usual, pulled from machines in different states as she moved steadily west. In the early morning hours of March 13th, she bought gas in Brooks, Oregon. By that afternoon, she had reached Bellingham, Washington, near the northern edge of the state, and there, on that same day, she did the most ordinary things. She was seen at a restaurant, and at 2:10 in the afternoon, she bought a single ticket at a mall movie theater to see the film American Beauty. That is the last confirmed trace of Leah Roberts alive, a young woman going to the movies alone on a rainy afternoon in a town at the top of the map. 5 days later, on March 18th, a couple out for a jog along a remote road in the mountains east of Bellingham noticed something wrong. There were clothes scattered along the roadside, some of them tied to the trees. Following that trail led them to the edge of an embankment, and down at the bottom of it, a white 1993 Jeep Cherokee with North Carolina license plates rolled off the road and abandoned. The road was Canyon Creek Road, a side route off the Mount Baker Highway that serves a few isolated homes and old logging camps in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, not far from the Canadian border. The Jeep was Leah's, but Leah was not there. And this is where the story stops making the sense it seemed to be making. Because when investigators examined the crash, the details did not add up to a simple accident. By their reconstruction, the Jeep had gone off the road traveling only around 30 to 40 miles an hour. At that speed, anyone inside would almost certainly have been hurt. And yet, there was no blood, no sign that an injured person had been in the vehicle. There were no footprints leading away from the scene into the snow and mud. Her belongings were still inside, including a keepsake box. There was cat food in the Jeep, which told investigators she had likely brought her kitten all the way from North Carolina, and yet there was no sign of the kitten either. It was as if the crash had been arranged, and then everyone and everything had simply lifted away from it. Years later, That suspicion hardened into something closer to evidence. In 2006, the Jeep was re-examined, and investigators found that a wire to the starter relay had been cut. In plain terms, that cut wire would have allowed the vehicle to be sent forward under its own power, to roll and accelerate without anyone inside pressing the gas pedal, which means it is entirely possible that no one was in the Jeep at all when it went over the embankment. The crash, it seems, may have been staged, made to look like an accident to draw the eye and hide something else. On that examination, they also recovered a fingerprint from under the hood and, on an article of Leah's clothing, DNA from an unidentified man. So what happened? Have you ever wondered how a case can be, all at once, a story of someone who chose to leave, and a story of someone who was taken? That is the terrible knot at the center of Leah Roberts. On one hand, everything about the beginning of her journey speaks of a young woman traveling of her own free will, grieving, searching, following a book across the country, planning to come home. On the other hand, a staged crash, a cut wire, a stranger's fingerprint, a stranger's DNA, and clothing tied to trees are not the marks of a woman who simply walked off into the woods to find herself. There was one tip from an anonymous caller who was certain he and his wife had seen her at a gas station in Everett, well south of the crash site, in the days around her disappearance, which would suggest she was alive and moving after Bellingham. Investigators over the years also took a hard look at a local man who claimed to have seen Leah in the area, a man with a background as a mechanic and in the military, details that, given that cut starter wire, made them look at him more closely. But nothing was ever proven, and no one has ever been charged. The crash site sits close enough to the Canadian border that authorities coordinated with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, checking for any sign that Leah might have crossed over. There was none. Extensive searches of the steep, forested country around the road turned up no trace of her, then or since. Her brother and sister traveled out to Washington in the days after the Jeep was found and searched themselves, wondering at first whether she had struck her head and wandered off dazed into the forest. But no hospital in the area had treated any injured or disoriented young woman, and the terrain gave up nothing. There is a strange doubleness to the way Leah left and to what she left behind. She had pulled unusual amounts of cash from machines across the country as she drove, the behavior of someone who did not want to be easily followed. And yet she had also left money for her roommate to cover the bills and a note promising she was not driving toward any kind of ending. She had chosen her destination the way a pilgrim chooses one. The book she loved most, the story of road trips and mountains and searching for meaning, has scenes set on a lookout peak in the very county where her Jeep came to rest, as though she had driven 3,000 miles simply to stand at the foot of a page. Whether she found the peace she was looking for on that trip, or whether someone took it from her in the final few miles, is the thing no one has ever been able to say. And that cut starter wire changes how you hear the whole story, because a young woman searching for herself does not usually need to rig her own car to roll off a cliff without her in it. Year after year, the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office has kept the file open, coordinating now and then with authorities across the nearby border, chasing the occasional tip and finding every time that the trail simply ends where the Jeep did, on a logging road in the shadow of the mountains. From her favorite book, more than 2 decades later, Leah's case is still open, with the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office, and it is still classified, honestly, as a mystery rather than a homicide or a runaway, because no one can say for certain which of those it is. A young woman drove across an entire country to stand at the foot of the mountains from her favorite book, and somewhere in the last few miles of that journey, the trail simply ends. She wanted, in her own words, the opposite of an ending. She wanted to find something, and what she found on a logging road near the border is a question her family has been living inside of ever since. Let's go back a little further now, to the early 1990s, and to one of the biggest, brightest, most crowded events in all of Washington state. Because the next young person we are going to sit with vanished not from a lonely road or a quiet street, but from the one place a parent might think a teenager would be safest of all, surrounded by families lit up like a carnival with a bus that ran straight home. She is, to this day, the only person ever to disappear from that fair in its entire history. Let's talk about Misty Copsey. Misty was 14 years old, a lively, ordinary teenager living in Spanaway, south of Tacoma, with her mother, Diana. She had blonde hair and green eyes, a small mole beneath one eye, a scar under one knee, the little specific marks by which a mother knows her child anywhere. For days she had been begging to go to the Puyallup Fair, the enormous late summer state fair that draws crowds from all over the region to its rides and its games and its endless deep-fried food. Her mother worked a night shift, caring for an elderly woman, which made getting Misty home again complicated. Diana was hesitant, but she relented, the way parents do, on one condition, that Misty have a safe way home. Misty promised she would take the last bus back from the fairgrounds. And so, on the afternoon of September 17th, 1992, a Thursday, Diana dropped her daughter and her daughter's 15-year-old friend, Trina, at the fair. As Misty climbed out of the car, she told her mother that she loved her. That was the last thing Diana ever heard her say. The two girls did exactly what you would hope two teenagers would do at a fair on a warm September evening. They rode the rides, they ate the food, they wandered the midway under the lights with the Ferris wheel turning overhead and the whole loud, glittering, happy machinery of the fair going on around them. And when the evening wound down, the plan was for each of them to make her own way home. Trina lived close enough to walk, about 1.5 miles. Misty was going to catch the bus back to Spanaway. So the two friends said goodnight, and they parted, and Misty went to find her, ride home. But something small and ordinary went wrong. Misty missed the last bus. You're standing where she was standing, at the edge of the emptying fairgrounds, late on a Thursday night in September of 1992. The rides are shutting down. The crowds are thinning out into the parking lots, families herding tired children toward their cars. The lights are still on, but the energy is draining out of the evening, and a 14-year-old girl realizes she has just watched her only easy way home pull away without her. She did what a good kid does. She found a phone and she called her mother, and she told Diana that she had missed the last bus and that she needed a ride. There was some back and forth, the ordinary friction of a mother on a night shift and a teenager stranded across town. And then the call ended. A Pierce transit bus driver would later recall an encounter with a girl matching Misty's description, looking for a way home. And after that, Misty Copsey simply stops appearing anywhere in the record of the world. She never made it back to Spanaway. She was never seen again. There is a particular cruelty in what happened next, and it shaped the whole investigation. When a 14-year-old fails to come home from a fair, one of the first questions authorities tend to ask is whether she ran away. And in those early hours and days, the assumption that Misty might have simply left of her own accord took hold, even though those who knew her said she had no history of running away, nothing in her past to suggest it. That assumption, her family has long believed, cost precious time and let leads go cold that a faster, more urgent response might have caught while they were still warm. It is one of the quiet, recurring heartbreaks of these cases, the way a wrong first guess can follow a missing child like a shadow for years. For a long time, there was almost nothing. And then there was a piece of clothing. Sometime after Misty vanished, clothing was recovered in a rural area along Highway 410, the road that climbs from the Puyallup Valley up toward Mount Rainier. Diana looked at what was found, at a pair of jeans, and she was certain. Those were her daughter's clothes. She knew them. And to her, finding them out there, discarded along a mountain highway, could only mean one terrible thing. But the forensic picture was more complicated than a grieving mother's certainty. Testing on the clothing at the time reportedly did not produce Misty's own genetic material, but instead the genetic material of an unidentified man. So the clothing became one more thread that would not quite tie off, evidence that something had happened, without being able to say for certain exactly what or to whom. That stretch of Highway 410 carries a darker weight, and it is the source of one of the leading theories in Misty's case, though it remains a theory and nothing more. The remains of other young women were found in that same general area over the years, and the timing of several disappearances in the region, spaced out at eerily regular intervals, has led some to wonder whether Misty was one victim of a single person who was hunting the highways of that part of Washington. It is a dark and unsettling idea, and it is worth being careful with it, because a pattern the human mind draws across a map is not the same thing as a proven connection. Investigators have looked at it. Nothing has ever been established, but it is one of the reasons Misty's name comes up whenever people talk about the unsolved deaths along that road. There is another figure in this case, and he requires a careful, fair telling. Over the years, a private citizen inserted himself into the search for Misty, offering theories and help, and at first Diana welcomed the assistance, but over time she, and eventually the police, grew uneasy about how deeply this person had involved himself, and about some of what he said, until the strange situation arose in which one of the most active amateur investigators in the case had himself become a subject of suspicion. At one point he agreed to take a polygraph to clear his name, and then cancelled it and never rescheduled. And yet, in the end, authorities did not regard him as a serious suspect. He had at least a partial alibi for the relevant window of time. No charges were ever brought against him, and in fairness, he is presumed innocent, as is everyone else who has ever drifted through the long orbit of this case without ever being proven to have harmed her. His story is mostly a lesson in how an unsolved case can pull people into itself and tangle them up, and how badly, after enough years of silence, the people who love a missing child want someone, anyone, to be the answer. The Puyallup police never fully let go. Detectives have carried Misty's case for years, one investigator working it almost exclusively for well over a decade, with the investigation formally rebooted At the end of the 2000s, on the 25th anniversary of the night she vanished, the department tried something unusual and quietly devastating. They took over their own social media feed and, for a day, wrote in Misty's voice, reintroducing her to the world, telling the story of that September night as though she herself were telling it, describing the moment she climbed out of the car and told her mother she loved her. It brought a wave of new tips, and it brought Misty's name back to a public that had, in the churn of years, begun to forget. For all the strangeness that has gathered around this case, the heart of it stays very small and very simple. A 14-year-old girl went to the fair with her best friend, and she did everything her mother had asked of her except catch a bus she could not catch. The detectives who have carried the case have done so with real devotion, one of them working it almost to the exclusion of everything else for well over a decade, treating a girl he never met as though she were his own to bring home. They have gone back over the old evidence with newer tools. They have weighed the possibility that Misty was one victim among several taken along that stretch of highway toward the mountain. And they have weighed the possibility that the answer was closer and more ordinary than that. Someone who offered a stranded girl a ride on a night when her safe ride home had already pulled away. Neither possibility has ever been closed, and that first wrong guess, that early assumption that she had simply run off, is the kind of thing her mother has never fully forgiven, because in those crucial early hours, while people waited for a runaway to come home on her own, whatever trail there was went cold. Have you ever wondered what it does to a person to spend more than 30 years not knowing? Diana has lived every one of those years inside that not knowing, through false hopes and dead ends and the long, grinding weight of a question with no answer. The fair still happens every autumn, bigger than ever, hundreds of thousands of people passing under the same lights. And somewhere in the memory of one September night in 1992, a 14-year-old girl is still standing at the edge of it, having just missed the last bus home, calling her mother, saying she needs a ride. The case is still open. It is still, all these decades later, unsolved. And Misty Copsey remains the only person ever to walk into that fair and never walk back out. For the next story, we cross back over the mountains to the dry, wide-open country of eastern Washington, where the Columbia River bends through the desert and 3 cities sit close together on its banks. And this one is, in some ways, the hardest of all, because the person at its center was the youngest, and because it happened on the eve of a day that should have been nothing but joy. Let's talk about Sophia Juarez. Sophia was 4 years old, and she was one day away from turning 5. She lived in Kennewick, in the Tri-Cities of eastern Washington, on the 100 block of East 15th Avenue, in a full and loving home crowded with family, her mother, her grandmother, and several aunts and uncles all under one roof. She was a shy little girl by nature, the kind who stays close and does not wander off on her own. She loved cartoons and Barbie dolls and coloring. She had a gap where her top front teeth were coming in, and more than anything, in that first week of February in 2003, she was excited, the way only a small child can be excited, about her birthday. She was about to turn 5. Her family has described her simply as a beacon of sunshine. You're on East 15th Avenue on the evening of February 4th, 2003. It is winter in the high desert, cold and dark early, porch lights coming on up and down the block, the mountains a low shadow at the edge of the sky. Inside Sophia's house, there's the ordinary warmth of a big family on a weeknight, the anticipation of a birthday the very next morning, a cake somewhere, a present maybe already wrapped. And Sophia, 4 years old, is outside near her home in that last hour of the evening, in the way that children in close neighborhoods once moved freely between the porch and the sidewalk and the pool of the streetlight. Somewhere between about 8 o'clock and 9:15 that night, in the space of that single hour, Sophia was taken. She had been walking near her home, along the sidewalk on that block, moving towards South Washington Street. And then she was gone. When her family realized she was not there, the ordinary winter evening detonated into panic, a frantic search of the house and the yard and the block, turning up no sign of her at all. What happened next made history, though it is a history no family would ever want to be part of. The Kennewick police called in detectives within hours. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined almost immediately. Flyers with Sophia's photograph went up. Searchers went house to house, block by block, in careful quadrants that widened as more help arrived. Over the next several days, more than 500 people took part, police officers and federal agents and dive and rescue teams and civilian volunteers. Aircraft and helicopters equipped with heat-sensing cameras flew over the waterways and the neighborhoods and the empty desert on the edge of town. And by the morning of February 5th, the day that should have been Sophia's 5th birthday, the state of Washington issued its very first Amber Alert. Sophia Juarez was the reason that system was switched on in Washington for the first time. That is a terrible kind of distinction for a 4-year-old to hold. For all of that effort, the searches turned up nothing. And the trail of the case is really the trail of a few witnesses and a few vehicles, none of which have ever quite been made to fit together. There was a witness, an adult, who came forward almost immediately after seeing the news coverage in those first days, and who reported having seen a little girl matching Sophia's description that night, crying, being led away toward a van by a male who was, disturbingly, laughing. Years later, when the case was reviewed again, that witness was described by police as highly credible, and the description was refined. The person seen leading the girl away was described as a young Hispanic male, only about 11 to 14 years old at the time, which would make him roughly 30 by now, light-complexioned, short, with a rounded, boyish face, possibly a mark on one cheek, and dark, short, wavy hair. Think about that for a moment. If that account is accurate, the person last seen with Sophia may himself have been little more than a child. Then there are the vans, and here the record grows tangled. Early in the case, authorities were looking for a full-size van described as faded orange, a mid-1990s model with no side windows, carrying a Washington plate that included a double letter, driven by a white man in his late 30s with a thick blonde beard. Later, the description that surfaced alongside the credible witness was of a different vehicle entirely, an older, full-size panel van, light blue or silver or grey, the kind of plain work van a painter or a contractor might drive, with no side windows, stopped on a nearby side street. Police have been careful and honest in saying that they do not actually know whether either van is connected to Sophia's disappearance at all. They are simply pieces gathered on a winter night more than 20 years ago that have never locked into place. Have you ever wondered how a whole community holds a wound like this for 2 decades? In Kennewick, people who are there still say they remember exactly where they were and what they were doing the night Sophia went missing. The way people remember only the largest events of their lives. Her image has been placed on the sides of state patrol vehicles so that she rides the highways still, a small face asking to be remembered. Age progression images have been made, showing the young woman she would be now, and every so often, a new possibility flickers to life and then goes dark again. In the spring of 2021, a short video spread across social media, filmed far to the south in Culiacan, in the Mexican state of Sinaloa, showing a young woman who said she had been kidnapped and did not know where she was from, and who bore some resemblance to what Sophia might look like grown. For a moment, the whole case held its breath. Kennewick investigators tracked the lead down with real care, obtained a genetic sample, and had it tested. It was not Sophia. Even so, the detectives said they would keep going, because their goal, whatever the answer turned out to be, was to bring some resolution to the family Sophia was stolen from. But there is one piece of this story that time has already closed, and it is the heaviest one. Sophia's mother, Maria, spent the rest of her life not knowing what had become of her daughter. She searched, and she waited, and she hoped, and she died before any answer ever came. She went to her grave, as the family has said, without knowing what happened to Sophia. Whatever justice or truth may still be waiting somewhere out in the years ahead, it will come too late for the person who wanted it most. There is a particular weight to the fact that Sophia's case gave Washington its very first Amber Alert. The system that now flashes across highway signs and lights up phones all over the state. The one that has helped bring other children home in the years since, was switched on for the first time because a little girl in Kennewick did not come inside on the night before her birthday. Her community has made sure the reason is not forgotten. Her face has ridden the sides of state patrol vehicles up and down the highways of Washington, a small and steady reminder that she is still owed an answer. People who lived in the Tri-Cities in the winter of 2003 still speak of that night the way people speak of the largest events of their lives, remembering exactly where they were standing when the word went out that a child was missing. And every year, on the birthday she never reached, the people who loved Sophia have gathered to remember her, holding on to the small, stubborn hope that somewhere she is grown and alive and might one day find her way back to a family that never stopped looking. Today, more than 20 years on, the case remains open and unsolved. Sophia would be a grown woman now in her 20s, and it is at least possible, the way it is possible in Tika's case, that she is alive somewhere, living a life she does not know was stolen. Her community has never let her go. On what would have been her birthdays, they have remembered her. And the question that hangs over East 15th Avenue is the same one that has hung there since the night before she turned 5. A shy little girl who did not wander, who loved cartoons and coloring and was counting the hours to her birthday, was there on the sidewalk in the cold, and then she was not. Someone knows how that happened, and Sophia is still waiting to come home. Let's pause here for a moment and think about the place itself, because if you lay these stories out on a map of the Pacific Northwest, something almost unbearable begins to show in the geography of it. This is a region of deep forests and long rivers and mountain passes, of small towns pressed up against enormous stretches of wilderness, of logging roads that run for miles without a single house, of coastline and islands and a quiet border with another country. It is one of the most beautiful corners of the continent, and it is also, quietly, one of the easiest places in the world for a person to disappear into. A child taken from a street in a timber town can be over a mountain range and into a wholly different landscape within a couple of hours. A young woman's car can be sent off a remote road into a national forest where the trees close over everything. A little boy can vanish from a playground on an island you can only leave by water. The very things that make this region feel safe, its smallness, its quiet, its habit of trust, are the same things that have let so many of these cases go cold. Everyone knows everyone until suddenly no one saw anything. The door is never locked until the one night that it matters. The park is only a few steps away until it is somehow far enough. There is a particular kind of grief that grows in a place like this, where the wilderness sits right at the edge of the porch light, holding its silence. And the families in these stories have had to learn to live beside that silence, to raise other children beside it, to grow old beside it, never knowing whether the answer they need is a mile away or 100 miles away, buried under the same green canopy that fills the postcards. We have 4 more people to sit with tonight, in Oregon, and back in Washington, and across the water in Canada. And each of them, in their own way, was swallowed by that same enormous, beautiful, and indifferent landscape. So let's keep going, gently. The next story carries us across the Columbia River, south into Oregon, to the wooded hills on the northwest edge of Portland, to a small rural school tucked among the logging trails and the tall firs. And this case is different from the others in one particular way. In most of the stories we have sat with tonight, the mystery is that no one saw anything. In this one, the mystery is that so many people saw so much, and a little boy still vanished in the middle of a school day from inside his own elementary school and has never been found. Let's talk about Kieran Horman. Kieran was 7 years old, a second grader, a boy in glasses with a wide, gap-toothed grin. He was fascinated by science, and especially by animals, and most especially by frogs. His favorite was the red-eyed tree frog, that vivid little creature with the bright green body and the startling red eyes. He was, in a small and touching irony, drawn to forensic science, to the idea of solving mysteries. And on the last morning anyone saw him, he was wearing a black t-shirt with the letters of a television crime show across the front and a handprint graphic below them, along with black cargo pants and black sneakers with orange trim. His parents had divorced when he was small. His father was an engineer. His mother had gone through a serious illness that had briefly required Kieran to live full-time with his father, and in that stretch, his father had remarried, so that Kieran's daily life included a stepmother, a half-sister who was still a toddler, and, in the wider family, an older half-brother and a stepfather who loved him. He was, by every account, a happy, curious, well-loved little boy. The morning of June 4th, 2010, was the day of the science fair at Skyline Elementary School, out on Skyline Boulevard in the hills northwest of Portland. It was a cool, bright, early summer Friday, and the school was full of parents and children moving from project to project. Kieran had built a display about the red-eyed tree frog, a homemade trifold poster covered in shades of green, with diagrams of the frog's life cycle glued carefully in place. His stepmother had driven him to school that morning to help him set it up. You're in the hallway of Skyline Elementary on that Friday morning. It smells like a school, floor wax and paper and children. The gymnasium is bright with poster boards and proud, nervous kids standing beside their projects. Somewhere in that room, a 7-year-old boy in a crime show t-shirt is standing next to his frogs, beaming at a camera, and someone takes his picture. It is an ordinary photograph of an ordinary, happy morning. It would become one of the most widely circulated images of a missing child in the history of the Pacific Northwest. By his stepmother's account, she watched Kieran walk down the hallway toward his classroom at around 9:15, and that was the last she said she saw of him. Another student reported seeing him near the school around 9 o'clock, and then the ordinary machinery of a school day did something it was never designed to do. Kieran never arrived at his classroom, and he was quietly marked absent for the day, but no message went home to anyone. No one thought to ask where he was. The hours of the school day passed, the science fair wound down, classes let out, and it was not until 3:30 that afternoon, when Kieran did not step off his school bus at the usual stop, that his family realized something was wrong. The first call to police came at just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, nearly 7 hours after he was last seen. 7 hours in which a child could have gone very far indeed. That delay would change the law. In the aftermath, Oregon lawmakers passed a new requirement that public schools notify parents when a child is unexpectedly absent by the end of that same school day, so that no family would ever again lose those crucial hours the way Kieran's family lost them. It is one of the small, hard-won things that sometimes grows out of a tragedy, a rule written in the shape of a mistake, so that the mistake is never repeated. It did not, of course, bring Kieran back. What followed was the largest criminal investigation in the history of the state of Oregon. Search teams focused on a wide radius around the school and on an island in the Columbia River several miles away, though law enforcement never fully explained why they searched where they searched. More than 1,000 volunteers joined in. Divers went into ponds. Teams walked the dense, steep logging country around the school. By late that autumn, the effort had cost well over $1 million and generated thousands upon thousands of tips. And it turned up no trace of him. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single physical sign of where a 7-year-old boy had gone. Now, this is the part of the story that has to be told with great care, because it involves a living person who has never been charged with any crime and who is entitled fully and without reservation to the presumption of innocence. Early in the investigation, scrutiny settled on Kieran's stepmother, the last person to say she had seen him. Investigators have cited what they described as inconsistencies in her account. It was reported that several witnesses recalled seeing her leading Kieran back toward her truck that morning, which did not match her statement that she had left him walking to class. It was reported that she was asked to take polygraph examinations in the days that followed, that the results were not regarded as favorable, and that she declined to take a further one, while other members of the family were said to have cooperated fully with testing. It was reported that she could not fully account for her movements in the hours after leaving the school, and said she had spent much of that time driving through the wooded hills west of the city, trying to soothe her fussing toddler daughter. And a friend of hers who was working in that same wooded area that day was later questioned as part of the investigation and, by the accounts given, cooperated with detectives. Those are the things that were reported and that fueled years of public suspicion and speculation. But it is essential to be clear about what did not happen. No one was ever charged. No grand jury ever returned an indictment. The stepmother has consistently denied knowing anything about what happened to Kieran, and no court has ever found otherwise. Kyron's mother came, over the years, to believe openly that her former daughter-in-law was responsible, and she said so publicly, and she pursued a civil lawsuit built on that belief. But a mother's grief-born conviction, however deeply felt, is not a verdict, and the criminal case has never been proven against anyone. Whatever any of us may privately wonder, the honest state of this case is that we do not know who took Kieran Horman, or how, or where he is, and the person most talked about across all these years remains, in the eyes of the law and in simple fairness, not guilty of anything. The marriage did not survive the case. The parents divorced from that stepmother in the years that followed, and the central question stayed exactly where it had always been, unanswered. Have you ever wondered how a case this scrutinized, this public, this exhaustively investigated can still, after all this time, have no ending? Grand juries have quietly convened over the years. Searches have gone back out into the hills more than once, and still there is nothing that closes it. The investigation has never been abandoned. In more recent years, prosecutors and the sheriff's office have taken it up again with fresh eyes, digitizing the tens of thousands of pages of the case file, bringing in new technology and additional investigators, working with federal partners to re-examine old evidence and old statements, looking for the thing that might have been missed in the assumptions made early on. There is a standing reward of $50,000 for information that resolves the case. Every year, hundreds of new tips still come in. The sheer scale of what was done to find him is hard to hold in the mind. In the months after he vanished, grand juries were convened, witnesses were called, friends and family members were subpoenaed and questioned, and the school itself became, for a time, a crime scene. Its young students interviewed one by one about their missing classmate, their small legs not yet reaching the floor from the chairs they sat in. The effort ran well into the millions of dollars and generated thousands of tips, and still it produced no arrest and no trace of Kieran at all. In the years since, the case has never been allowed to go fully cold. More recently, prosecutors and the sheriff's office announced a top-to-bottom review, digitizing the enormous case file so that modern tools could finally search across all of it, adding investigators and working with federal partners to look again at old statements and old evidence, specifically to test the assumptions that were made in those first frantic days. The hope is that something set aside too early, filed under the wrong theory, might finally be seen for what it truly is. It is slow, painstaking work, measured in pages far more often than in breakthroughs, but it is being done. And that in itself is a kind of promise to a family that has now waited more than a decade and a half for a single true answer. And through all of it, Kieran's family has kept his memory as a living thing rather than a case number. His mother has made a small tribute in her backyard that she calls Kieran's pad, filled with frog decorations in honor of that red-eyed tree frog he loved so much. His childhood bedroom has been kept as it was. She has said that it is sad, but that life keeps moving even when you would give anything to stay in the year your child disappeared, and that, as far as she is concerned, Kieran still exists and is still part of the family, which is, in the end, the truest thing anyone can say about him. A curious, gap-toothed 7-year-old who loved frogs and mysteries walked down a school hallway on a bright June morning in front of his classmates and his teachers and his own science project, and stepped, somehow, straight out of the world. And his family is still standing in that hallway, all these years later, waiting for him to come back around the corner. There is one more recent case that carries the same terrible quality as so many of these, the quality of a small child slipping out of the world in an ordinary moment while in the care of family. It takes us to the east side of Seattle, to Bellevue, to a cold autumn morning at the end of 2011. Let's talk about Sky Metalwala. Sky was a 2-year-old boy, born in the early autumn of 2009. His parents had come to the Seattle area from far away, his father originally from Pakistan, his mother born in the former Soviet Union, and by the time Sky was small, their marriage had come apart into a bitter divorce and a painful custody fight over him and his older sister. It is not this channel's place to referee the accusations that two people made against each other in the middle of a divorce, and so we will not. What matters for Sky is that by the autumn of 2011, his mother had custody, and that on the morning of November 6th, according to her account, something went wrong on an ordinary errand. By her telling, Sky woke up sick that morning, and she loaded him and his 4-year-old sister into her car, an older silver 2-door sedan, and set off to drive him to a hospital in Bellevue. Somewhere along the way, on a stretch of road that runs beside the tall concrete sound barrier of the state highway, she said the car ran out of gas. She pulled over onto the shoulder, and then, by her own account, she left 2-year-old Sky strapped into his car seat, alone, in the parked car, while she and his older sister walked away to find help. She said she was gone for somewhere between an hour and an hour and a half, and when she came back, she said the car was there and Sky was not. He has never been seen again. You're on the shoulder of that road on a grey November morning. The traffic is moving past on the highway just beyond the barrier. A car sits parked and empty on the roadside, a child's car seat inside it, and a 2-year-old boy who was supposedly asleep in that seat only an hour before is simply gone, with no one on that busy stretch of road having seen a thing. From very early on, the investigators who responded found that the account they had been given did not hold together. When they examined the car, it was not out of gas at all. There was fuel in the tank, and the vehicle started and ran without any mechanical trouble. No empty gas can was ever found. Detectives also came to understand that, apart from his mother, essentially no one had seen little Sky for around 2 weeks before the morning he was reported missing, which meant the timeline of when he was actually last alive and well was far less certain than a single missing morning. And there was an unsettling detail that investigators noted, a resemblance between the account they had been given and the plot of a television crime drama that had aired in the Seattle area the night before. None of that on its own answered anything, but all of it pointed the investigation in a direction it has never really left. Here is where care matters most, because Sky's mother has never been charged with any crime. Over the years, the police have said, in about as direct a way as police can say such a thing, that they believe she holds the key to what happened to her son, and they have pleaded with her again and again publicly to come forward and simply talk to them and help them find him. By the accounts given, she spoke with investigators on the day she reported Sky missing, and then declined to participate in the investigation after that. But wanting someone to answer questions is not the same as proof of wrongdoing, and no court has ever found her responsible for anything. She is, like everyone else in these stories, who was never charged, entitled to the presumption of innocence. What is true, and what is heartbreaking, is that the one person believed to know the most about that morning has not helped to find the little boy at the center of it. Sky's father took a very different path. He cooperated fully with the investigation, took a polygraph, and threw himself into the public search for his son, holding vigils and appeals over the years, and he was eventually granted sole custody of Sky's older sister. He has said, through all of it, that he believes his son may still be alive somewhere, and he has never stopped asking for the one piece of information that might bring him home. The investigation itself was vast. Detectives from the local police, from a neighboring city's department, and from the federal government worked the case together. They ran down more than 2,000 tips. They poured many thousands of hours and well over $2 million into the search. And still, all these years later, there is no sign of Sky, and no charge against anyone, and no answer to the simplest and most agonizing version of the question. If he was never really in that car on that November morning, then where was he? And if he was, then who took a sleeping 2-year-old off the shoulder of a busy road without a single person seeing it happen? Sky Metalwala would be a teenager now, more than a decade past the age he was when the world lost track of him. His case is still open. His father is still waiting, and the road beside the sound barrier still carries its traffic past the spot where a car once sat empty on the shoulder, with a child's car seat inside and no child in it. Before we come to the end tonight, there are 2 more people we need to sit with, and they carry us to the far edges of this story, the furthest back in time and the furthest north on the map. The first is the oldest of all the cases we have talked about tonight. It reaches back more than 60 years to a warm summer night in Tacoma in the last days before Labor Day weekend in the year 1961. And in some quiet, sorrowful way, it is where the Pacific Northwest's long history of vanished children begins. Let's talk about Anne Marie Burr. Anne was 8 years old. She lived with her parents, Beverly and Donald, and her 3 younger siblings in the north end of Tacoma, in a house on the 3000 block of North 14th Street. She was the oldest of the 4 children, the responsible one, the big sister. Her mother would later say something about the way they had raised her that has stayed with people for decades. They had taught Anne that the world was a good and safe place. They had taught her that people were kind. And in the grief of the years that followed, her mother came to believe that this had been a terrible mistake, that they had never taught their trusting little girl that some people could mean her harm. Anne was so trusting, her mother said, and her mother always suspected that whoever took her was probably someone Anne already knew. The night of August 30th, 1961, was the Wednesday before the long Labor Day weekend, and the Northwest had turned unusually warm and muggy. A thunderstorm rolled through in the dark early hours. Anne shared a bedroom with her little sister, who was only 3 years old and had a broken arm at the time, her arm set in a cast. Sometime in the middle of that stormy night, the cast was bothering the younger girl, and she was crying, and Anne, being the big sister she was, got up and walked her little sister down the hall to their parents' room. Their parents, half asleep, told the girls to go back to bed. Anne took her sister back to their room, and that is the last that anyone in her family ever knew of Anne Marie Burr. You're in that house on North 14th Street in the last dark hour before dawn. The storm has mostly passed. The family is asleep. A little girl who believes, because she has been lovingly taught to believe, that the world is good, is lying awake in a house that is about to be entered. When Anne's mother got up at around 5:30 that morning, she found her daughter's bed empty. And as she moved through the house, she found the things that have haunted this case ever since. The front door had been locked and chained the evening before, and now it was standing unlocked from the inside and open. In the living room, a window was open, and beneath it a wooden bench had been knocked over or moved. Outside, in the mud left by the storm, there were faint footprints, already softened and blurred by the rain. The family dog had not barked. The other children had not woken. There had been no cry, no struggle anyone heard. Someone had come into that house in the storm, and Anne had gone out of it, and the night had covered over exactly how. What followed was, at the time, the largest search in the history of Tacoma. Hundreds of police officers and volunteers, along with military personnel, combed the neighborhood, the nearby orchards, the fields, the gullies. They searched for days, and then for weeks. There was no ransom demand, or at least none that was ever judged credible. There were no witnesses. There was no body. There was almost nothing at all for investigators to hold on to, and slowly, painfully, the case went cold, even as it never once left the minds of the people who had loved her. Over the years, the false hopes came and went, the way they do in every case like this. In the mid-1960s, a prison inmate in another state wrote to the Burr family, claiming that he and another man had taken Anne while looking for farm work, and that her body lay in a field in Oregon. The family gave the letter to the police, and years later a crew went out and dug in that Oregon field. A flood had reshaped the land in the years between. They found nothing. It was one more door that opened onto nothing. And then, more than 20 years after Anne disappeared, her case became attached to one of the most infamous names in American crime. Because in 1961, in that same neighborhood of Tacoma, there had lived a teenage boy, about 14 years old at the time, who was already known to local police as a young window peeper and petty thief, and who would grow up to become one of the most notorious serial killers the country has ever known. His name was Ted Bundy. In the years after his crimes were uncovered, and especially as his execution approached, the theory took hold that Anne Marie Burr may have been his very first victim, taken when he was still a boy living just streets away. In some interviews, Bundy hinted at a story about taking a young girl from her home, harming her, and leaving her body in a ditch. But when the Burr family wrote to him directly and asked him, plainly, whether he had taken their daughter, he denied it in a handwritten letter. He was executed in Florida in 1989, taking whatever he truly knew with him. It is worth being careful and fair about this theory, because it is only that, a theory. There are serious people who have studied it closely and come away doubting it. At 14, The Bundy that police knew was a peeping Tom and a shoplifter, not yet anything worse. And the pattern of how such offenders typically escalate does not fit neatly with the abduction of a child from her bed years before his known crimes began. In later years, investigators tried to settle the question with science, comparing genetic material recovered from the Burr home against a sample connected to Bundy. The results were inconclusive, the evidence too old and too degraded to yield any clear answer. Complicating everything, much of the original case file has, over the long decades, gone missing. And so the question that Bundy's name attached to Anne's story remains exactly as open as it was before he was ever suspected. He may have been the answer. He may have been a shadow the case simply reached for in its desperation for any answer at all. Anne's parents both lived long lives, and both died without ever learning what happened to their daughter, her father passing in the early 2000s and her mother a few years after him. Her case is still open with the Tacoma police, more than 6 decades on, one of the oldest active missing child cases in the state. Modern science has been brought to bear where it can. In more recent years, investigators have submitted family genetic material to national databases in the hope of a match, and have periodically reviewed the tips and the fragments of evidence that survive, though much of the original file has been lost to the passing decades. But the theory that always felt truest to Anne's own mother was never about a famous name at all. It was the quiet, unbearable idea that whoever came into that house in the storm was someone Anne already knew and trusted, someone she would not have cried out at, someone the family dog did not bark at, a neighbor, a familiar face, the kind of person that a little girl raised to believe the world was gentle would have had no reason at all to fear. That is the version her mother lived with for the rest of her life, and in some ways, it is the hardest version of all, because it means the danger was never a stranger in the dark, but something much closer to home. Anne Marie Burr was 8 years old, a trusting big sister who got up in the middle of a thunderstorm to comfort her little sister with the broken arm, and then went quietly back to bed in a house that was no longer safe. She believed the world was good, because the people who loved her had told her so. And somewhere out in that good world, more than 60 years ago, someone proved them wrong and has never had to answer for it. For our final story tonight, we leave Washington and Oregon behind, and we cross the water to the Canadian side of the Pacific Northwest, to Vancouver Island, to the quiet coastal city of Victoria. And we come to the youngest child of all, and to a disappearance so sudden, so total, and so impossible that it changed the way an entire country thinks about the safety of its children. Let's talk about Michael Dunahee. Michael was 4 years old. He was a happy, energetic, outgoing little boy, the son of Bruce and Crystal Dunahee, with a baby sister named Caitlin. On the afternoon of Sunday, March 24th, 1991, the family went out to the playing fields at Blanchard Elementary School in Victoria, where his mother was going to take part in a women's flag football practice, and his father was going to watch. It was an ordinary family Sunday. Michael was wearing a blue hooded jacket with red lining and red cuffs, a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles t-shirt, colourful rugby pants, and blue sneakers. The family arrived at around 12:30 in the afternoon. The playground was only a few meters from the car, close enough to see, close enough to call across. Michael wanted to go and play while the grown-ups got ready. His mother has told this part of the story many times over the years, and every time it cost her something. She made sure he was looking at her, she said. She made him understand that he could go to the park by himself, but that he had to stay there and not leave with anybody and wait for his father. She remembers a feeling as she watched him go, what she has called the little butterflies in her stomach, a mother's quiet unease. And she has said, in the plainest and most heartbreaking words, that she has always regretted not listening to those butterflies. You're at the edge of the Blanchard fields on that grey Sunday afternoon. There are around 50 people there, players and spectators spread across the grass. A 4-year-old in a turtle t-shirt runs the few meters to the playground to wait for his dad, in full view of a crowd in broad daylight on an ordinary weekend. His father walked over to the playground only a few minutes later to collect him. And Michael was not there. He was not on the swings or the slide or anywhere in sight. Bruce came back and said he could not find Michael, and the football game stopped, and about 50 people fanned out across the fields and the surrounding streets, calling his name into the afternoon. No one had seen him leave, and no one had seen anyone take him. In a crowd of 50 people, in the middle of the day, a small boy had simply ceased to be there. His parents called the police at once, and what began that afternoon grew into one of the largest missing person investigations in the history of Canada. Roadblocks went up across the southern end of Vancouver Island. The ferries and the airlines were alerted, because to leave the island, you generally have to cross water. Officers and volunteers searched through garbage bins and refrigerators and freezers and the crawl spaces under houses. Anywhere a small child might be hidden or might hide. Over the 3 decades since, the police have received more than 11,000 tips. A reward of $100,000 has stood for information. And through all of it, across all those years and all those thousands of leads, there has never been a single solid answer. There has been no confirmed sighting, no physical trace of him anywhere, and no witness to the moment itself. There have been flickers of false hope, as there always are. On one occasion, a man in the Vancouver area came forward, saying he had no memory of his life before the 1st grade and believed he might be the missing boy, and his resemblance was striking enough that police tested his genetic material. He was not Michael. Years later, someone cruelly pretended to be Michael on social media in order to ask his family for money, forcing them to publicly confront yet another wound. Through every one of these, Bruce and Crystal Dunahee have kept searching and have turned their private grief outward into work that helps other families of missing children, building the kind of resources and support systems that did not exist when their own son vanished. His mother, Crystal, became a familiar and steady presence in the Canadian effort to protect and find missing children, working for years with a provincial organization devoted to exactly that cause, so that Michael's name came to stand for something far larger than one family's grief. A website built together with a National Child Protection Center keeps his story and his family photographs and home video where anyone can find them, alongside maps of the fields where he was last seen and age-progressed images of the man he might be today. And each spring, on the anniversary, there has been a walk to keep the hope alive, neighbors and strangers gathering to remember a boy most of them never met. Have you ever wondered what it takes to hold on to hope for 35 years? Michael would be a grown man now, well into his 30s, a life entirely unlived in the eyes of the people who love him. His case is still active. The police who work it have said something that is true of every single story we have sat with tonight. All it could take, they have said, is one person who saw something on that grey afternoon in 1991, or who has carried a secret ever since, or who simply knows and decides at last to say so. A 4-year-old boy in a Ninja Turtle shirt ran a few meters to a playground to wait for his father in front of 50 people in the middle of the day. And more than 3 decades later, that short, sunlit run is still the last place anyone can find him. 9 people, 9 ordinary mornings and evenings and afternoons, spread across half a century and a few 100 miles of the same green corner of the country. And tonight, as the video comes to its quiet end, not one of these cases has an answer. Lindsay Baum was carried over the mountains and found years later in a forest 100 miles from home, and no one has been charged. Tika Lewis vanished from a crowded room in the space of a single bowling frame, and there is still no named suspect. Leah Roberts drove across an entire country toward the mountains of her favorite book and left behind a staged wreck and a question no one can untangle. Misty Copsey missed the last bus home from the fair and became the only person ever to disappear from it. Sofia Juarez was taken from her own sidewalk the night before she turned 5, and the mother who searched for her died without ever knowing. Kieran Horman stepped out of the world from inside his own school in front of everyone and has never been seen again. Sky Metalwala vanished from the shoulder of a busy road as a sleeping 2-year-old, and the person believed to know the most has never explained how. Anne-Marie Burr was carried out of her own home in the middle of a thunderstorm more than 60 years ago, and her parents died without an answer. Michael Dunahee ran a few meters to a playground in front of 50 people and was gone. And a whole country has never stopped looking. Every one of these cases is open. Every one of them is still somewhere being worked, and every one of them is still waiting on the same thing. The one person who knows something finally deciding to say it out loud, because behind every one of these case files was a real person, and it matters, more than anything else we have talked about tonight, that we remember them that way. Lindsay wanted to be a writer and an illustrator and a veterinarian because she loved animals more than almost anything, and she was 2 weeks from her 11th birthday. Tika was a small girl who almost never left her mother's side, and there is a video of her laughing on Christmas morning that her family can still play. Leah wrote poetry in a coffee house and taught herself the guitar and loved a book about the open road so much that she followed it clear across the country. Misty begged for days to go to the fair, and the last thing she ever said to her mother, climbing out of the car, was that she loved her. Sophia loved cartoons and Barbie dolls and coloring, and she was counting the hours until her 5th birthday. And Kyron loved frogs and puzzles and stood beaming beside a science project he had built with his own small hands. Sky was a 2-year-old still learning his words, who woke up sick one November morning and should have been carried home safe. Anne was the trusting big sister who got up in a storm to comfort her little sister with the broken arm. And Michael was a bright, energetic little boy in a turtle t-shirt who only wanted to play on the swings while he waited for his dad. They were daughters and sons. They were children and a young woman with her whole life still ahead of her. They were loved completely, and they deserved so much better than what happened to them. Have you ever noticed how these stories always turn on the smallest, most ordinary things? A short walk between 2 houses, a single bowling frame, An afternoon movie in a town at the top of the map, a missed bus, an hour on the sidewalk before bed, a hallway between the gym and a classroom. None of these people did anything unusual. They lived the same small, safe, everyday moments that all of us live without a second thought. And it was in exactly those moments that they were taken. That is the quiet weight these cases leave behind, and it is not meant to frighten anyone. It is meant, if anything, to make us gentler, to make us look up a little more often, to make us notice the people around us and remember that the ones who go missing are never just names on a flyer, but somebody's whole world. It is worth sitting too, with how differently these stories can end without ever ending at all. Some of these children were found, and some never were. Lindsay was carried home to her mother at last, in the hardest possible way, and even that did not bring an answer. Others are still officially only missing, their families suspended in a grief that has no shape to it, no grave to tend, no date to mark. And a few of these cases carry a particular kind of ache, the ache of a family member or a person of interest who was looked at hard and never charged, so that suspicion hangs in the air for decades without ever becoming certainty, and the people left behind are asked to live with a question that points terribly at someone they once trusted. We have tried tonight to hold all of that fairly, to say plainly what is known and to say just as plainly what is not. Because in cases like these, honesty about our own uncertainty is a form of respect, both for the missing and for everyone who has never been proven to have harmed them. There is a reason we tell these stories slowly and carefully and out loud. It is not for the mystery. It is because being remembered is the one thing we can still give to a person the world lost track of. Somewhere out there tonight, in a small town or on a mountain road or along a quiet street in the Pacific Northwest, the truth about each of these 6 still exists. Someone drove somewhere, someone saw something, someone has carried an answer for years, and cases like these are not solved by the passage of time. They are solved when a single person decides that a family's need to know is finally heavier than their own silence. So tonight, as you sit with the stories of Lindsay and Tika and Leah and Misty and Sophia and Kyron and Sky and Anne and Michael, try to remember them not for how they disappeared, but for who they were before that evening came. Remember the frogs and the guitar and the balloons let go into a grey sky, and the little girl reaching up toward the pedals of a racing game, and the child 2 weeks from a birthday, and the boy who loved a mystery walking down a bright hallway, and the sleeping toddler on the shoulder of the road, and the big sister who got up in the storm, and the little boy in the turtle shirt running toward the swings. 9 people who went out into an ordinary evening in this green and quiet part of the world and never came home. And if you are the one who knows something about any of them, about a car on a logging road, or a van on a residential street, or a face in a crowded bowling alley, or a quiet house in a storm, please know that it is not too late. It is never too late. The families are still here. The detectives are still working the files. The rewards are still standing. And every one of these cases has always waited on the same single thing. One person deciding at last that the truth matters more than the silence they have been keeping. None of these 9 were ever only a mystery. They were people. And in the hearts of the people who loved them, they still are. Their stories are still unfinished, and somewhere, tonight, someone knows why.